The Vietnam War, or Second Indochina War, is infamous. It was one of the most gruesome Cold War era conflicts, and it tarnished the USA's reputation forever. But America isn't the only large Western nation the Vietnamese have routed, and for there to be a second Indochina War, there had to be a first. Here, in the wake of World War II, Ho Chi Minh stood up to the French to expel them from what was then French Indochina. It was a brutal 7-year conflict that is so often swept under the rug. In this 3-part video, we mean to rectify that. This is the story of the First Indochina War, or as many in Vietnam remember it, the Anti-French Resistance War. As with many of the 20th century's wars, the First Indochina War was sparked by World War II. On the 25th of June 1940, France fell to the Germans, and the Vichy government, headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, replaced the Third Republic. At this time, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were ruled by the French in what was called French Indochina, so these colonial territories fell under the Vichy administration. As the Vichy government collaborated with the Germans, with Vichy France ultimately coming under direct German control, it had to collaborate with Germany's soon-to-be Axis allies too, notably Imperial Japan, and the Japanese had had their eyes on Indochina for quite some time. Fighting the Chinese in the concurrent Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese naturally wanted to cut off China's supply lines. One major supply line was the Kunming-Haiphong Railway, which went from the Indo-Chinese port of Haiphong to Hanoi and then into the Chinese province of Yunnan. Staging their troops in Indochina, specifically in the region of Tonkin, would allow them to open up a new front against their enemies in China too. With the collaborationist Vichy government now in charge of French Indochina, Japan started laying on pressure in a political sense, and the Vichy government was given an ultimatum. On one hand, they could close all supply routes to China, let Japanese troops pass through Indochina, let Japanese air forces use their air bases, and give the Japanese Navy basing rights at Guangzhou. On the other hand, the Japanese could invade. While an agreement was ultimately reached, some Japanese units weren't interested in negotiating, so they attacked the French border post of Dongdang and the province of Lang Son. From the 22nd to the 26th of September 1940, Japanese forces marched into northern Indochina. Following that, Japan said sorry, released the French they had taken as POWs, and returned control of the towns they had seized to the French, at least on the surface. After all, why would they go to war with the French when they could just rule them from behind the scenes and use French Indochina as a base from which they could fight everyone else? Not to mention that puppeteering the French would get a whole lot easier after the tripartite pact had been signed on the 27th, and Japan officially had Germany on its side. In Vietnam, however, not everyone was happy living under the thumb of Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai, a puppet of a French government that was itself puppeteered by the Japanese. The people's lives were more uncertain than ever, and as World War II escalated, they whispered of revolution. Before we get to that though, the Vichy French were having serious problems in October 1940, just after the Japanese invasion. Emboldened by the fall of France, the Thai Major General, Plaek Pibulsonggram, decided to bomb French Indochina and then launch an offensive through Laos and Cambodia to regain territory previously lost to the French. The Thai army was better equipped, more experienced, and numerically superior to the French, boasting some 60,000 troops, as opposed to the 50,000 troops fielded by the French. They also had more aircraft and more experienced pilots. French naval forces reigned superior in the sea though. From early to mid-January 1941, Thailand appeared to have the upper hand, overrunning Laos and pushing into Cambodia. But on the 17th, French naval forces defeated the Royal Thai Navy in the Battle of Ko Chang, and it seemed the tide was turning. It was shortly after this that Japan stepped in as a mediator, arranging a ceasefire on the 28th. To satisfy Thailand, the Japanese made the French relinquish swaths of Laos and Cambodia to Pibul Songram. For the time being, this worked very much in Japan's favour, as the Japanese had improved their relationship with Thailand without absolutely destroying their relationship with the French. Now, back to Vietnam and those whispers of revolution. In February 1941, the leader of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, a man named Ho Chi Minh, returned home from France and established the Viet Minh in Pac Bo Cave in Vietnam's Cao Bang province. This was a coalition of communists and nationalists united in an anti-colonial independence movement against the Vichy French and the Japanese. Over the next 4 years, barring the 14 months he spent imprisoned in China, Ho Chi Minh consolidated his strength, receiving funding from the United States, the USSR, and China, and rallying as many as 1 million Vietnamese to his cause. On the 22nd of December 1944, he created the Vietnam Liberation Army and made General Vo Nguyen Giap, nicknamed Red Napoleon, its military commander. Just 3 days later, a contingent of the Liberation Army fought its first battle and won. This was the Battle of Kai Phat and Nang Gan, in which Red Napoleon personally led 33 revolutionaries in a raid against 2 French outposts, killing the outpost's armed French officers and forcing 37 colonial troops to surrender. As loot, Red Napoleon seized 40 rifles, which they would make good use of in the battles to come. By this point in the Greater War, following massive defeats in Burma and the Philippines, things weren't looking so hot for Japan. What pushed them over the edge in French Indochina, however, was the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Fearing an Allied invasion of Indochina, as well as a French uprising following the destruction of the Vichy government back in France, the Japanese stepped out from behind the curtain and seized Indochina from the French in a coup d'etat between March and May 1945. Here, some 55,000 Japanese overran some 65,000 French and French colonial soldiers throughout Indochina, capturing 15,000 and killing 4,000. Some 3,000 French fled into China, others joined the pro- or anti-Japanese guerrilla movements. At the same time, the Vietnamese were struggling with a different sort of enemy: famine. In the Vietnamese famine of 1945, between 400,000 and 2 million people starved to death as a direct result of the French and Japanese occupation, but also factors beyond their control. Natural disasters, including a series of droughts, floods, and typhoons, destroyed edible crops. The French and Japanese seized, hoarded, and exported food and burned it for fuel, forced the locals to grow industrial crops instead of edible crops, and generally did a terrible job of managing the distribution of food and alleviating starvation. Allied airstrikes against roads, warehouses, and transportation facilities did not make things any easier. All in all, Japan's coup d'etat cost Vietnam dearly. But the end times were near for the Japanese Empire. On the 6th of August, the US dropped the first bomb on the Japanese home islands, and on the 14th, Japan agreed to surrender. With his people starving and the Japanese laying down their guns, Ho Chi Minh's forces seized Hanoi and most of Indochina, persuading the puppet emperor Bao Dai to abdicate. This was known as the August Revolution, an event punctuated by Ho Chi Minh's famous independence speech, which borrowed language directly from the US Declaration of Independence. But Ho Chi Minh wasn't in the clear just yet. In fact, his first Great War was only just getting started, and by the time of his death, he would be neck deep in the dead. The First Indochina War is often overshadowed by the Second Indochina War, or Vietnam War, despite the fact that it was one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Where we left off, the Japanese had just lost the Second World War, and Ho Chi Minh had just taken Hanoi and much of Indochina, and persuaded the puppet emperor Bao Dai to abdicate in what was deemed the August Revolution. Now that World War II was over, the Japanese let the Viet Minh take control of Indochina, while the French and British were moved into Saigon to restore order, and the Chinese occupied Hanoi. The Japanese in South Vietnam surrendered to a Franco-British task force led by Generals Philippe Leclerc and Douglas Gracie, while those in the north surrendered to some 200,000 nationalist Chinese troops under General Liu Han. Of course, both of these actions compromised Ho Chi Minh's hold on Indochina. While the French government reinstated in France, the French wanted their colony back, and they were willing to fight for it. From September 1945 to March 1946, the Franco-British task force released Japanese and Vichy French POWs to help them assert control in Saigon. While they primarily fought the Viet Minh, several other Vietnamese organizations got involved, fighting on both sides of this 6-month war. Ultimately, the task force beat the Viet Minh back, driving them out of the city and into the countryside. Following the task force victory, General Gracie took his soldiers and left Indochina to General Leclerc and his men. On the other hand, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese Kuomintang or Nationalist Party, wanted to increase his influence in Vietnam, directly contesting the Viet Minh. To achieve this, he armed the Viet Quoc, a Vietnamese nationalist party modeled after the Kuomintang. According to the Red Napoleon, the Viet Quoc was a group of reactionaries plotting to rely on Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and their rifle barrels to snatch a few crumbs. Unfortunately for the Viet Quoc, the nationalist Chinese troops withdrew from North Vietnam in February 1946, agreeing to do so if the French let go of their holdings in China, including Shanghai. Without the Chinese there to protect the Viet Quoc, the Viet Minh ate them alive, massacring thousands in what was called the Great Purge. Without the Chinese nationalists there to bother them, the French moved on to the north, landing in the port of Haiphong. Throughout 1946, fearing things would return to how they were before World War II, the Viet Minh opened up peace talks with France. These were known as the Fontainebleau Agreements, but an actual agreement was never reached, as the French refused to give the Viet Minh the freedom they wanted. In November, armed clashes broke out in Haiphong, and the French answered by bombarding the Vietnamese sections of the city, killing 6,000 in what became known as the Haiphong Massacre. On the 19th of December 1946, the Viet Minh set off explosives in Hanoi's power plant, consigning the city to darkness, and then started attacking French soldiers and civilians alike. Red Napoleon's order to his 30,000 soldiers was to stand together, go into battle, destroy the invaders, and save the nation. By the 18th of February, the French had driven the Viet Minh out, and the First Indochina War had begun. As with every post-World War II conflict, both the Viet Minh and the French enjoyed support from various foreign nations and internal organizations at different stages of the First Indochina War. From the get-go, the Viet Minh were advised, trained, and armed by forces of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, and even fought side by side with them at times. This relationship became even stronger after the CCP defeated the Kuomintang in the concurrent Chinese Civil War. To put the CCP's support into perspective, it shipped some 155,000 small arms, 58 million rounds of ammo, 4,600 artillery pieces, over 1 million artillery shells, and much war material and supplies to Vietnam between 1950 and 1956. The Viet Minh also had a second Red ally in the USSR, which provided weapons, ammunition, artillery pieces such as the Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, trucks such as the Gaz-51s, fuel, military advisors, and more. A remnant from World War II, Thousands of Japanese soldiers avoided repatriation and shame at the end of the global conflict to stay in Indochina and fight for the Viet Minh. As many as 5,000 helped to train the Viet Minh during the First Indochina War, working out of military installations such as the Quang Ngai Army Academy. As for the French, they enjoyed support from the French Union, which has succeeded the French Empire, at least in name, in 1946. The French Far East Expeditionary Corps was composed of soldiers from French territories, including but not limited to Morocco, Senegal, and Tunisia, while some 325,000 Indo-Chinese troops fought for them too, some under the former Emperor Bao Dai's Vietnamese National Army, some with the kingdoms of Cambodia and Laos, and some with other anti-Viet Minh organizations in Vietnam. Hoping to prevent the spread of communism following the CCP's victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the United States quickly became one of France's biggest supporters. It provided supplies, soldiers, and naval and air assistance, and even toyed with the idea of dropping a nuke somewhere. Perhaps the US's greatest contribution was Operation Passage to Freedom, however, where they transported some 310,000 civilians and soldiers out of North Vietnam and into South Vietnam between 1954 and 1955. Returning to the early days of the war, Red Napoleon avoided a head-on confrontation with the French, resorting to guerrilla tactics instead. In October 1947, however, the French almost delivered a knockout blow. This was Operation Lay, in which the French dropped 1,100 paratroopers on the city of Bac Can, hoping to catch Ho Chi Minh with his pants down. While unsuccessful in capturing Ho Chi Minh, some 15,000 French troops entered the city as some 40,000 Viet Minh troops closed the noose on the paratroopers, and the French were able to wound or kill between 9,000 and 10,000 of them. Offensives like Operation Lay were expensive though, so France tried to achieve victory through politics instead. In March 1949, the French entered an agreement with the former Emperor Bao Dai, granting him control of Vietnam as an autonomous government within the French Union. This was called the State of Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh saw right through it. He wanted, quote, real independence, not Bao Dai independence. That same year, the aforementioned Vietnamese National Army was created, fighting in league with the Expeditionary Corps. As we mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War in 1949, and this changed the whole dynamic of the First Indochina War. Now, the Viet Minh could retreat to the Chinese border to pick up vast quantities of weapons and supplies. Armed by the CCP, Red Napoleon claimed victory after victory in attacks on French garrisons in North Vietnam. One of his larger victories, he claimed, was in the Autumn-Winter Border Campaign. Between the 30th of September and the 18th of October 1950, the Viet Minh wiped out some 8,000 troops of the Expeditionary Force and Vietnamese National Army, making extensive use of ambush tactics along Route Colonial 4 from Cao Bang to Lang Son. Some of the heaviest fighting took place in the first half of 1951. Unwilling to lose any more ground to the Viet Minh, the famous French general Jean-Marie de Latte de Tassigny arrived in Indochina and established a defensive line around Hanoi, effectively closing it off against the Gulf of Tonkin. This was the aptly named De Latte Line, composed of a network of 1,200 concrete blockhouses connected by roads capable of bearing 30-ton tanks. In January, Red Napoleon tried to breach the line at Vinh Yên, but got completely smashed upon launching a head-on assault with his 308th Division. De Latte answered this reckless charge with airstrikes and napalm, killing as many as 1,600 enemy troops and wounding a further 6,000, according to French estimates. This battle marked the end of the 1951 good times for Red Napoleon, who suffered defeat after defeat, testing the De Latte defenses. The war was not over though. Far from it. In January 1952, General De Latte left Indochina with cancer, to which he succumbed soon after, and Red Napoleon became emboldened, spreading through most of the Tonkin region. The French, now commanded by General Raoul Salan, had to make a big play, or Red Napoleon would become too powerful to stop. By now, it should be clear that the First Indochina War was indeed a politically complicated, blood-stained affair, made even more complicated by the concurrent Chinese Civil War and the rising backdrop of the Cold War. The French General Raoul Salan had just taken over from General Dalat, who established the Dalat Line and killed the momentum of Viet Minh General Vo Nguyen Giap, or Red Napoleon's 1951 offensives. With Dalat gone, the Viet Minh continued its attack on French forces withdrawing from Hoa Binh, where they had dealt the French a defeat, albeit at a heavy cost, back in November 1951 after General Salan took over the defense. By the 22nd of February 1952, the French had finished their withdrawal to the Dalat Line, where they regrouped and staved off guerrilla attacks for much of the year. In October, Red Napoleon tested the French defense once again, this time at Nha San. But French hedgehog tactics proved too much for the attackers, who withdrew after taking some 6,000 casualties. Afterwards, the French strategically bailed from Nha San to prepare for a larger Viet Minh assault on French outposts along the Black River. With Red Napoleon applying heavy pressure to the vulnerable outposts, General Salan was looking to make a big play. On the 29th of October, he launched Operation Lorraine. In response to his 30,000-man offensive into Viet Minh territory, which was aimed at the district of Phu Yen, Red Napoleon simply withdrew his forces, sabotaging the French as they advanced. Salan had no choice but to can Operation Lorraine and begin a withdrawal. At Chan Muong on the 17th of November, the Viet Minh ambushed the French column, inflicting heavy casualties until French air support and an Indo-Chinese bayonet charge cleared the way for the column's retreat. Some 1,200 French troops perished in the failed operation. The following year, Red Napoleon switched up his tactics, planning to invade neighbouring Laos instead of smashing headfirst into the Dalat Line in the hopes of taking Hanoi. In May, General Salan was removed in favour of General Henri Navarre, who studied the successes of French hedgehog tactics at Nha San and opted to put a stop to the Viet Minh's invasion of Laos at a small town named Dien Bien Phu on the border. The French launched Operation Castor on the 20th of November 1953, dropping paratroopers over Dien Bien Phu so they could secure its airstrip. The paratroopers clashed with the Viet Minh, but by the 22nd, the town was in French hands. Under Colonel Christian de Castries, the French bolstered their defences, deploying over 9,000 troops plus 1,800 support personnel and setting up a hedgehog defence to once again defeat the aggressive Red Napoleon. But the Viet Minh general had learnt from his experience at Nha San. He wouldn't charge recklessly into the spikes of the French defence. Instead, he would lock down their airstrip with anti-aircraft guns, bombard the crap out of them with artillery, and place some 50,000 troops in the wooded hills surrounding the valley and the French position, which he likened to a rice bowl. On the 13th of March 1954, it began. Viet Minh artillery, mortars, and recoilless rifles opened up on the French position designated Beatrice. The French battalion commander was blown apart and communications crumbled. After the French were nice and soft, the Viet Minh advanced, breaking through the French defense with sappers and gunning their way to victory at this position. After this crushing blow, the French artillery commander in charge of the defense committed suicide with a hand grenade. He could do nothing to stop the Viet Minh artillery dug into the surrounding hills, and he couldn't live with the shame of it. On the 14th and 15th of March, the Viet Minh laid waste to the French position, Gabrielle, with artillery, and then assaulted the stunned defenders, just as they had done at Beatrice. Here, as it was at Beatrice, the Viet Minh infantry assault cost the attackers more lives than they took, but the position fell nonetheless. At the nearby position of Anne-Marie, many of the defending troops abandoned their posts or defected on the 17th. So low was their morale at this point. For the rest of the month, Red Napoleon mostly left the French to stew in their own misery, while he prepared for a massive assault on the heart of Dien Bien Phu. At night, on the 30th of March, the Viet Minh 312th Division attacked the French position Dominique, seizing 2 of the position's outposts, but then biting off more than they could chew. As they advanced on the next outpost, French artillerymen leveled their 105mm howitzers and fired them into the division's ranks, 18th century cannon style. The French also fired on the enemy troops with anti-aircraft guns, ultimately forcing a retreat. The Viet Minh had better luck at the French position Elian, taking Elian 1 and most of Elian 2 on the 31st. French counterattacks at Elian 1 and Dominique were ultimately unsuccessful, but French Major Marcel Bigard managed to drive the Viet Minh out of Elian 2 with the aid of French tanks. The French also clung tooth and nail to the position Huguet, which contained the airfield and was located on the west side of the Nam Yam River, and French planes continued to do their best to resupply the men via parachute troops despite heavy Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire. By the 5th of April, Red Napoleon had switched up his tactics again. French artillery and air support were delivering some serious hurt to his ground forces, so he ordered his men to dig trenches. It was in these muddy hellholes that the morale took a turn for the worse, with soldiers being threatened with death if they didn't continue the attack, and the wounded often going unattended. Things didn't improve for the Viet Minh when Major Bigard bombarded Elian 1 to the moon on the 10th of April, and then followed said bombardment with small unit infiltrations, ultimately retaking the position. Over the Nam Yam River, however, things were looking better for the attackers. By the 22nd of April, the Viet Minh had taken the vast majority of the airfield, preventing French reinforcements from landing there. Without fresh supplies and troops, it was now only a matter of time for the French. In early May, Red Napoleon wrested control of Elian 1 and the remainder of Dominique and Huguet. The French at Elian 2 held on for a while longer, even against the Soviet Katyusha multiple rocket launchers the Viet Minh brought to the party. They could not withstand the detonation of a mine beneath the outpost, however, and with Elian 2 devastated, Red Napoleon sent in some 25,000 troops to mop up the remaining 3,000 French. The last words to come out of the French headquarters were as follows: "The enemy has overrun us. We are blowing up everything. Vive la France." By the end of it, the Viet Minh had captured some 11,700 French, of which over 4,400 were wounded. As many as 2,300 died in the battle, while more than 1,700 were branded MIA. On the Viet Minh side, the French estimated that they slew 8,000 and wounded a further 15,000 men. Either way, the French defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a game-ending blow to the French in Indochina. While they were fighting at Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 Geneva Conference was in progress, and the French defeat influenced the conference's outcome. In light of France's ever-weakening position, there would be a general ceasefire. Vietnam would be temporarily partitioned into what was, in essence, the Communist North Vietnam, or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and South Vietnam, officially the Republic of Vietnam. France would withdraw to the south and then get the hell out of Indochina, and there would be an election in July 1956 to unify Vietnam. Additionally, people could move between the north and south without hassle for 300 days, facilitated by the US Operation Passage to Freedom, which we mentioned in part 1. Not everything went according to plan, however. The new Prime Minister of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, wasn't interested in following through with the July 1956 election, and many of Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh soldiers stayed behind in the south. When the Viet Minh realized that a fair election was not on the table, they took up their guns, and this eventually escalated into the Second Indochina War, or as some know it, the American War in Vietnam. If you've stuck with us from part 1, thank you. You're a legend. Overall, what do you think? Did you know the First Indochina War was so intense? Were you aware that it set the stage for the Vietnam War we all know and love? Do you know anything about this 7-year, 7-month conflict that we didn't cover in any part of this video? Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below.